Great. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another CLTV or Connected Learning TV Hangout on Air. Today is July 27th, 2017. Amazingly, it's the end of July already. And I'm Christina Cantrell. I'm the Associate Director of National Programs at the National Writing Project, and thrilled tonight to have a chance to talk with Kira Baker Doyle and Hadley Ferguson. So today's conversation is the third in a three-part series. We've been doing a series with Kira Baker Doyle around her new book, Transformative Teachers, Teacher Leadership and Learning in a Connected World. Here's my dog-eared and book copy of this book. We are really excited tonight to continue to talk to Kira about this work. And we're joined by Hadley Ferguson, who's the Executive Director of the EdCamp Foundation. EdCamp's a partner here at Educator, Innovator, so we're thrilled to have Hadley on. We realize this is one of her first webinars actually on CLTV, so welcome, Hadley. We're really excited to have you. And thank you all for joining us today who are tuning in. And we want to make a special thanks to all our guests for making time to be here tonight. If you're watching this Hangout, you're welcome to tweet questions or comments and share resources using the hashtag Connected Learning. We're also going to watch the hashtag Teachers Transform, which is the hashtag that Kira's been using for her book. And if you have questions specifically about the book or concepts about the book, feel free to use that hashtag Teachers Transform. Okay, so why don't we get started with a round of introductions. Maybe the two of you could just sort of give your name, you know, more about your work and a little bit about what brings you to this specific conversation today. Kira, you're to my left, so maybe, do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Kira Baker Doyle. I'm an Associate Professor of Education at Arcadia University. I'm the author of Transformative Teachers. What background do I bring here? Before I got into being a professor, I taught in Philadelphia, deep roots in the city. And you'll see, if you read the book, you'll really see those deep roots kind of emerge because of a lot of the folks that the stories come through are from Philadelphia. And I want to kind of give out a special shout out to the Teacher Action Group and Caucus of Working Educators in Philadelphia. They're running a book series this summer, book groups, lots of different gatherings of teachers in the area coming together, reading and sharing books. And there's one group that's devoted to reading and discussing transformative teachers, and they may be following along tonight. So I wanted to just welcome them if they are following along. And if you're not in the group, but you'd like to join the group, we are meeting this coming Monday and then August, and then the following week after that at the Unitarian Church in Germantown. So I guess you can tweet me if you're interested in joining that, and I'm at KJBD on Twitter. That's it for me.
Great, thank you, Kira, and welcome book group members if you're listening in. Hadley, go for it.
I am Hadley Ferguson, and I am the Executive Director of the EdCamp Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with EdCamps, they began in Philadelphia in 2010, and it's participant-driven professional development. So teachers get together, usually on a Saturday, and decide what they want to talk about rather than going into an auditorium and being talked at. It's about conversations and collaboration. And since 2010, there have been over 1,600 EdCamps around the world. We're in 32 countries. One of the latest countries was in Pakistan, in Islamabad, Pakistan, which is really pretty exciting. They've been in all 50 states. And I was one of the original founders of EdCamp Philly, which was the first one. And at that point, I was doing what the rest of my career has been, which was to be a middle school history teacher. So I left the classroom to do this work and am excited to be working with teachers as they build their practice.
Great, thank you, Hadley. Yes, really excited about this. So let me just take a moment and sort of go back. We've done, as I said, this is the third part of a 3-part series. And the series is organized around the sections of Kira's book. So in the first session, and you'll see the Philadelphia theme continue here. We did a broadcast that and a conversation that was really about what is a transformative teacher. So in that broadcast, you'll see Sam Reed, who is a Philadelphia teacher at the U School, and Kira really in a dialogue, both about their relationship as well as like the core idea of relationships in being in and among transformative teaching and among transformative teachers. This idea of storytelling also comes up as like a core piece of this work. And then the conversation moves into sort of like this focus on collective action and collective power, and the collective power that the teachers have together and coming together as leaders and designers. And much like Hadley said, you know, really being agents in their own professional work and practice. And then I would say in that story, you hear much about working alongside both each other's colleagues as well as working alongside students and communities. So very powerful conversation that we started with. That moved us really fluidly into the second conversation that we had around designing, organizing, and leading in a connected world. That brought together a group of teachers, teacher educators, as well as researchers. And we talked through sort of the agentive practices that Kira's noticed transformative teachers utilizing to support their work, including making, hacking, and connecting. And that conversation really got us into sort of why are we doing these things? And I feel like that why started to get unpacked really well in that conversation and in really interesting ways that, you know, we could continue to talk about for a long time. So I hope, you know, the book discussion group and everything starts to continue that conversation. And I feel like it really nicely brings us here to the third series, which is really about this, you know, supporting transformative teachers and supporting educational change. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, I think in very broad strokes. Kira, I'd love you to unpack that a little bit. But I wanted to just note that in this chapter, you really have a header that's changed for what? So it's really this like focus on social justice and equity in the middle of this focus on change and transformative teaching. So I hope that sort of brings us up to where we are today. And Kira, I'd love for you to sort of talk to us about this sort of the way that you've been thinking about this work and change forward in this work and where you'd like this discussion to go tonight.
Sure. Thanks, Christina. And thank you for kind of bringing us along this journey, reminding us kind of where we came from, and, you know, that first starting with really thinking about the, from an individual perspective, characteristics, and then moving into collective work, ways that teachers work collectively. And then this third session is really thinking about the big picture. So that question of, so what is the change that is happening as a result of this kind of work? Why is it important? How is it making a difference? And then how can organizations and institutions that want to support transformative teachers also take part in doing that? How can they be? What roles can they take in supporting them? And that goes from education advocacy groups to schools of education. And so those are some of the questions that I'm hoping that we unpack a little bit tonight. And I know that we'll get a lot of really great insights from talking with both Hadley and with you, because this book also explores a lot of the work that the Connected Learning Alliance and National Writing Project has done in supporting transformative teachers, as well as EdCamp and EdCamp Foundation. So those are some of the things that we'd like to kind of explore, I think, tonight in this work. And I think also to keep in mind something that you mentioned in that overview, and that I think is maybe that we can kind of carry along as a thread that came up in our first book group meeting as I met with some folks who've been reading the book, is this idea of how can, if teachers would like to bring agency into their classroom and help their students be agents of learning, then they also have to be agents as well, agents of their own learning. That you cannot expect your students to be agents of their learning without engaging that in essence yourself. It's the same way that in National Writing Project, you can't teach writing unless you are a writer, right? And so I think that this book is really talking about how can teachers be agents of their learning, of their profession, and model agency and connect through that same work. So let's just kind of hold that as we're talking about this last piece. And I'll let Hadley kind of introduce a little bit about EdCamp. I know she did already a general introduction, but maybe how does that tie into some of the big picture that we're talking about today?
Well, I think that it's just really interesting that this whole idea of agency, that there really is the push for having students be agents in their own learning, and yet almost all of the teachers who are in the classroom right now never experienced that in their own, pre-K-12, let alone in their college experiences, that most of them sat in rooms where the teacher was the authority. Even if there was some group work or this sort of thing, it was really very much teacher-driven or professor-driven. And that what happens, we know from the studies that when a teacher goes into a classroom, if the minute it gets stressful or they're uncomfortable, they revert back to the way they were trained. They might know that there are better ways to do it, but when they get stressed, when testing is coming up, when all these things are about to happen, they go back to their roots rather than, even if they 100% in their head know that they want to be giving the students more agency, they revert. And so part of what I think we're all aiming for is how do we take teachers and give them experiences that will move them, really move the needle, so that they have those times when they have agency on their own learning. And what happens at an ed camp is that you have teachers who are giving up a Saturday, voluntarily going to talk to other teachers. And that very step of registering and coming to an ed camp is what, for me, the beginning of their growth process. Because at that point, they're saying, I need to be in charge of my learning. I have to stop waiting for someone outside to do it, and I need to become active in this process. And that through the conversations that they experience at an ed camp that are generated from their own questions and their own passions, they begin to see, oh, wait a minute, this is what it feels like in my gut. This is what it feels like. And I think that once they've experienced that, then they're actually on the next path. So that what we find is that people who attend ed camps are much more active on social media, in interacting with other teachers, in building networks and growing their own learning. And so I think that whole aspect of providing teachers with the means to gain agency over their learning is really the first step in this whole process. And then from there, the sky's the limit almost. You've shaken them out of the passive professional development is what gets done to me, to professional development is what I do, which I think is I think that there's all kinds of things that can go on after an ed camp, but I think that for many people, the ed camp is the first time where they go, oh, wait, I can be in charge of this. I don't have to wait. I can take authority over my own learning.
I love the way, Hadley, you framed that first step of even like signing up for an ed camp as like a really significant move. And I think that's really powerful and something that in teaching in the connected learning classroom, a couple of people talk about small moves as like really having these incredibly opening effects, but sometimes it says really small moves and then starting to sort of acknowledge and support each other and celebrate each other for those small moves that we're making, because they really can have significant impact. So I really appreciate that as like a note about one beginning step.
It's interesting because we oftentimes in the classroom look for those small things to affirm in students and forget to turn around and do it for ourselves and give ourselves credit for the fact that it doesn't have to be life-changing. It can just be those, sort of practice for ourselves what we practice for our students.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you for that. Kira, I was thinking that we've been talking about the ways that, we could keep going in this direction, sort of like what do we see as some of the, like, as a teacher educator, what are some of the moves that you see teachers making, or what did you see in your book in this direction that, and that reflexivity between, what we want to see in our students and what we want to do for ourselves as professionals?
Yeah, I think I can start small and then go big a little bit here. So one thing I want to say is that I've talked to many teachers who some of whom kind of identify as like this transformative teacher, very kind of networked, engaged, and really committed to educational change from where they are, and some folks who are exploring those ideas, not there yet. And I would say across that range, oftentimes those folks that I find who are really deeply embedded and deeply engaged, when you ask them how they got there, they'll say something like, well, I didn't plan to get here. It was those little relationships that I started to build. It was those little small moves. There's those little commitments that I made, and it just brought me here. And so I think that there is something really interesting and important to recognize, that there's oftentimes never this big, huge plan of I'm going to change the world. It's I'm going to do something that's going to help me as a learner, and it brings folks. So that's on a kind of individual path. But I'm going to say from a broader perspective, and looking at the impact that this kind of shift, this kind of mindset shift has had, is that you're seeing now a real change in discourse about teacher leadership, and about what we expect, how we understand teachers to kind of interact in the professional world. And you see that in even the ways that teachers are talked about, even in the Department of Education, or in some ways, when you hear folks talking about leadership, it's talked about differently. We're also seeing a shift in kind of curriculum and understandings of curriculum. So when you hear people talking about, I'm getting a grant to have a makerspace in my classroom, or I'm doing Genius Hour in my classroom, or these kinds of newer innovative ideas, these are all ideas that were really that have been teacher driven, have come from teacher-led efforts and sharing that has happened often outside of school, either through kind of web spaces, internet spaces, or even face-to-face meetings, and it cultivates and grows there, and then kind of floods back into school spaces. So you're seeing like change, curricular change, and then you're also seeing ways in which even schools are changing. You hear about movements like green schools or teacher-led schools. And I'm not even going to speak about EdCamp, because EdCamp in itself, it's its own movement. I'm going to let Hadley talk about the impact that EdCamp have had. But I just want us to kind of think about from those how there's this connections from these very small moves and commitments to our own kind of agency over our learning, to becoming networked into some of these larger interest groups and these movements, and how much of an impact they're having on discourse about teacher leadership, professionalism, curriculum, school organization, and education on the whole. So I'm going to pause here, because I want to let Hadley kind of jump in and talk a little bit about where she's seen like impacts from of EdCamp and transformation there.
Well, I think that what's really interesting, Kira, is that that first step that we were talking about registering and showing up. A lot of times these are the sort of lone rangers in their school who want to bring about change but feel isolated. And that one of the things that the digital age has brought about is that many of those teachers are connecting digitally. But what we found at EdCamp is that there's an incredible power to the face-to-face as well. And that when you connect digitally and then you meet face-to-face, when you go back into the digital space, it's a completely other experience. And so the relationships that you can develop in, through Twitter chats or through Facebook groups are legitimate and real and can bring about real growth. But what we see is that people are really social creatures, and that it's wonderful to interact digitally. But when you get to see someone face to face and go, oh my favorite story is meeting somebody that I had known on Twitter for a while, and I met them face to face, and she was like, "You're so much taller than I thought." And I'm like, how did my face on a Twitter give you a sense of how tall I am? But yes, I guess I am taller than you thought I was. But that there's real power to the kind of engagement that happens when you're in the same space. But that then what I think is so exciting is that when you go back into the digital space, which is where a lot of these connections are happening, that is just that much more powerful. And that the relationships that are built there take the person who might feel isolated, and many teachers feel isolated in their classrooms anyway. You go in and close the door and it's you and those kids. That when you begin to build relationships that reach beyond that classroom and impact that classroom because you learn new things and bring it back into the classroom, that network really helps teachers to grow their practice and to begin to see themselves, see a path towards leadership that I think is new. I think that it used to be you were a teacher, and the only way to change that in terms of leadership was to go into administration. And I think that some of these teacher networks are beginning to model the fact that you can be very cutting edge and stay in your classroom and stay working with kids and be a real teacher leader rather than having to become an administrator. And for me personally, I think that that's really exciting because we want the best and the brightest with the kids. We don't want them, 2 or 3 steps removed, or at least that's my prejudice. I want them with the kids, and I think that really passionate teachers, that's what we want, is them to be supported in their own growth to stay with the kids.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. I think got in all my visits to EdCamp, there's usually a session that I go to at an EdCamp where there's a teacher who's presenting about something that they've published, like a book, or something that they're working on, or a collective of teachers who are doing that. And it's been really fascinating to see this plethora of new books that are coming out, written by teachers about new kinds of practices or different ways of thinking about teaching. Their own kind of pedagogies arising, and it wouldn't happen unless they had that community to help them think through and really develop that confidence. And so, and I think, the other thing is that's been happening for a long time with a writing project. I know that the writing project has a number of authors, teacher authors, and so it's kind of, writing projects has this tradition, and it's really interesting how you're seeing that now with EdCamp, and you're seeing that now with other places. When you open up those spaces for teachers to connect, they also develop a sense of they see their own expertise and authority, are able to kind of share that out.
I was going to pick up on that too, because this idea of teachers as leaders, teachers are leaders, actually is like a really powerful way to frame what we do as teachers, right? And I think the first step in that is really acknowledging this sort of role that being a teacher is an act of leadership itself. So being able to really take that on, I think, sort of has implications for it, right? So at the writing project and around the teaching of writing, part of how we do that is similar, that you write in order to, and become a writer and a teacher writer, and then sort of start to take leadership around the teaching of writing and supporting kids in writing. And then there's also this shift, and Kira, you talk about this too, and I think like in your book you talk about connecting as leading. You know, like actually like that role of connecting is a leadership move. And so, and at the Writing Project, we've traditionally talked about like it's like an invitation that as teachers we invite other teachers to work alongside us, to do inquiry with us, to think with us about our work, right? And so it's like that connecting piece is a leadership role. It's a leadership act itself and I think I even mentioned Chad Sansing before, but Chad always talked about it like as creating spaces of permission for others, you know, so we're like creating spaces of permission for ourselves as well as the others around us. And I do see that in the Ed Camp work, that it's really that sort of like, you know, you're making small moves in your practice and then, but you're doing that together. And again, it goes back to that collective power we brought up before. So yeah, and I also you know, prejudice of, you know, staying there with the kids. I think that's, you know, how we feel the leaders that we need today already.
Well, and I think that creating that space where teachers can ask the questions that they have, I mean, all the research shows that teachers want to learn from other teachers. They don't want somebody who's helicoptered in and gives a brilliant speech and then helicopters out again. They want people who have boots on the ground like them. And I think that then creates on us in small ways that those initial steps towards leadership. Because if you're sitting in a conversation with other teachers and someone asks a question, you can actually share your own expertise. That doesn't look big and flashy, but it's just, I've actually tried this, and this, you know, I tried it this way, that didn't work, but I tried it this way and it did work. You begin to see yourself in a different light as having some of those leadership skills that you might not have felt before you got together and started sharing those conversations. And so I think that what an Ed Camp does is create space for people to have those conversations, to feel safe in, you know, with other educators, to share what they're excited about, but also to just share, I'm hitting my head against a wall over and over again with this. Does anybody have any thoughts? And that, I think, is empowering for the teacher asking the question in the same way that connecting is empowering. But I think that the just being able to be together and try and solve these problems is really significant in terms of moving all the teachers towards more leadership.
Kira, I wanted to ask you, so I thought it was really interesting to talk about teacher leadership, curriculum and curriculum changes, as well as schools themselves. And just one of the things that I noticed in that conversation was this thing about makerspaces. So I think that there's, I mean, coming from a space where we think about writing as making, and so that the being productive together, creating stuff together, actually has been a key part of how we've worked as a network. And then to think about makerspaces as actually a place where teachers have really brought that into schools and helped to transform schools that way, I think is really powerful. I'm wondering, do you mind talking about that a little bit more? Could we, and
Sure.
Hadley, I'm sure there's lots of that work happening in your network too.
Yeah, I know that I will say, I know a lot of Ed Camp folks there's a lot of overlap between a lot of the kind of teacher-led movements and pedagogies and ways of teaching. And so certainly there's a lot of folks in Ed Camp who are involved in that, in the makerspace movement efforts. And I would say that I think there's two things that are interesting to me about makerspaces. I think one is that it's not just the space, right? There's a mindset and a kind of ideology around a makerspace, which kind of celebrates the process of making and production. And instead of looking so much on the one right answer or the final product, it's more of the process of exploration and learning and making, and learning a lot from those design principles and ideas. And so a big piece of the maker movement and maker space is really embracing some of those ideas of inquiry. And there's like I said, there's so much overlap from a lot of these different movements that kind of fit together in interesting ways. But I think that's one thing that's interesting. And then the other piece of it is the ways in which maker spaces kind of give permission for a more progressive kind of approaches to education. In some ways, that the work of being in a makerspace and creating a makerspace is a kind of progressive ideal, right? Like this idea is not all that new, right? It's John Dewey's kind of, dream, is that we learn by doing, and all that kind of jazz. I mean, there are some new things, especially with the new technologies and 3D printers and integrating all these kinds of pieces. But it does harken back to the good old Dewey days, right? And also constructivism, those kinds of things. But I will say that what's interesting, and it comes back to, is the permission that folks have gotten through even using the term makerspace. That there's some kind of unity around that term and around the idea that has come from many, many people coming together and using that term together, that has come from industry supporting that. And even Obama came out and said, like, makerism is the next new, industrial revolution. There's a lot of support behind that idea, and that's a critical piece. When you come back to that idea of permission, and giving teachers permission to experiment and try out and do new things, it's legitimizing. It's giving permission to do that kind of inquiry work that we know is really powerful for learning. And I will say, right before I did this book, I had just completed an ethnography of teachers working collaboratively together. And what I learned from that ethnography, the core heart of it, was how important permission was. And I thought it was interesting at first. I thought it was odd that this idea of permission kept coming up over and over again, because in our minds, when we think of permission, we think of somebody not in power, and somebody being subordinate. But the idea of permission got flipped on its head through this work. And permission became really looking for options, problem solving, finding ways outside of your traditional system to do new and interesting things. So that I think that the idea of makerspaces ties in very much to the idea of finding permission, finding new ways of giving teachers that leadership, that agency to make change in their classrooms.
And I think another part that goes with that is that part of the inquiry process is the sort of testing and failing and testing again and making it better. And that makerspace does that in a safe way. You're trying to, create something with LED lights or whatever, but it puts in place an investigation that allows for, it didn't work this time. Okay, well, now I got to get back there and try again. And I think that for many teachers, that sort of sense that there's a right way and a wrong way, that the makerspace ideas is, oh, no, wait a minute, I'm not going to get to the right way until I've tried it multiple other times. And it's sort of that emotional experience of continuing to try, the whole grit idea of just, I don't give up, but in something that's not high stakes, but allows for the experience of testing and learning and failing and testing and learning and growing. And that's the part that I think is so exciting about makerspace. And I think it's also part of why a lot of EdCamp people are makerspace people as well, because part of what's happening at an EdCamp is coming and asking questions and learning and growing and trying to make progress forward.
Yeah, and I would add to that, that makerspaces and makerism, it creates this kind of, it's a kind of a parallel. You've got the inquiry that's happening in the classroom, and the teachers can inquire along with that. So I think that there's I think that it's a great example of like a core practice or pedagogy that has evolved alongside a lot of this teacher leadership movements and networked teacher leadership movements that we've seen coming up. And so it's a good example of that.
It's also really modeling, though, that leadership isn't about authority at the front of the class. It's about doing an inquiry alongside your students rather than having to know the answer before you get started.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for making that connection, because I was starting to think like, okay, and Tara was reminding us of this time, like let's like surface the whys behind what we're doing too, and I think that part is so important, Hadley, in the sort of like anyway, I think it moves us into potentially a space of thinking about, we all are working with different organizations that work with teachers, right? So EdCamp Foundation, the National Writing Project, Kira's in teacher education and doing some networking around teacher educators. And so if we know social justice and equity is a core value that we hold, and we hold in a sort of connected learning frame and a participatory culture frame, in what ways are practices like this and helping us to build towards equity? And that feels like one of the key ways that we start to remind ourselves about the knowledge in the space that we all bring knowledge, including the kids, and that feels like a key step. And I was sort of thinking about like, oh, that's really feels important to make visible and to say out loud, and to shine a spotlight on again.
Well, I was going to say there was an article on the New York Times that came out last week about a number of universities that are now starting programs for young people to help them learn how to fail well, right? How to fail and get back up again, or that to embrace failure and to learn that you can learn from failure, because they have so many students who are coming in and really crashing and burning because since I guess this is now all the folks who are coming in have lived through No Child Left Behind and everything after that, high stakes testing, standardized testing. There is one right answer. You get the one right answer and you're fine, right? And then you come into college and things are different, or it comes into life and things are different. And so in some ways, this is also addressing some of the real limitations that students that people are realizing that are happening because of the real high stakes test environment that has been around for a very long time now, and the repercussions of that. And I think that's an issue as well. I mean, if you've got a lot of kids who are struggling to cope in educational spaces like college because they haven't had an opportunity to learn how that you can learn from failure, and that there are opportunities to learn from failure, and how to get back up again. That's an important piece of it all too. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to it, but that's one important piece.
I wonder, Kira, if that's also combined with sort of some of the parenting advice of the last 20 or 25 years that, sort of fragile self-identities of kids, and that parents, have to constantly be saying, that's the best finger painting ever, you are awesome, you're wonderful. And then you get into a high stakes testing, No Child Left Behind, where there is only one right answer. And if there's just sort of a fragile, and I don't know, I just think that there's an interesting confluence between the two.
Yeah, there's definitely a relationship between those two pieces, and I think that we just need, especially from the educator perspective, that we need to be really mindful of how we talk about or how we create opportunities for young people to explore, and learn in safe spaces, be able to learn from mistakes, and that mistakes are opportunities to give you opportunities to improve. That it's not always the high stakes, and that you're going to lose if you don't get this one right piece. That's not life, right?
Right. Well, and I think that another part of it is making teachers feel safe enough that they can model failure for their students.
Right.
That if something goes wrong, they don't have to be afraid of saying, you know what, I thought this was going to be a great activity and it's not working out right now, and I need to think on the fly. Can you help me with this or whatever? But that there are ways that in teacher networking and connections, if we can help, I think some of those connections can help teachers feel safe enough to begin to model some of that for their students.
That's really interesting, because it's a lot of what we talk about in connected learning is how key teacher vulnerability is, and how we talked about this idea of teacher courage and building teacher courage. And I think it all ties back into that, and back into the idea of small moves, back into a lot of these different pieces. And back into the parallel play between supporting student agency and supporting teacher agency.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that too. And I also wanted to bring some of the voices from the last webinar in, where we were talking about the socio-cultural context of being vulnerable, right? And so how that changes constantly and that as networks, how we sort of navigate and support each other through those changes seems like a really important thing for us to think about, to talk about. And recently there was a discussion on Educator, Innovator that brought together Muslim teachers and students, and really to talk. It was a discussion that bridged sort of the ways that Muslim students and teachers were using digital media to talk about matters of interest and importance to them in their communities, as well as the surveillance of their communities and the implications for that, for the ways that they use digital media and the ways that they networked with each other. And so it really got me thinking about sort of the constantly changing and the different perspectives on that. And I feel like it's a conversation that it's an important conversation that we have as teacher educators and teacher networks, how those contexts and what context we're working in at any given time, and any of our students and colleagues might be.
I would add, Christina, that one of the key, this goes into the work, some of the work that I did in looking at how organizations and larger networks support teachers and support teacher leadership, support teacher networks. And one of the threads that I saw among all of the different groups that I kind of spent time talking with is a real intentional approach to talking explicitly and spending time on talking about diversity, inclusion, and transparency in the kind of stance that an organization was taking, and doing work around that it's not sidelined, but it's almost like a central piece of the building of the group, the identity and the work of the group. And it's a very conscious, constant reflection, and not just reflection, but also an active work. And I think that that's a key piece of work that organizations that are working with transformative teachers need to kind of be thinking about and taking on. I was particularly struck by the work at the time when I was interviewing Hadley, talking with Hadley. She was developing some work just focusing on urban ed camps, and also trying to bring in more conversation around building some leadership, some diverse leadership in the group. And I'll let her talk a little bit about that. But I would say also in some of the other organizations I worked on, that is like a constant and a really key piece of driving the heart of the work.
Well, one of the early things that we've done, or not early, but recent things that we've done is adopted as a foundation a very strong anti-discrimination policy for the movement and for all of the ed camps that we support, requiring them to put that on their website to just make it clear from the beginning how serious we think that this is. And we are, at the foundation, we've realized that the teachers who can take time on a Saturday to go and either organize an ed camp or attend an ed camp are oftentimes not the teachers in the under-resourced schools. If you've got 45 kids in your class and no resources, getting out, taking the time and energy to go to an ed camp isn't happening all that much. We have urban teachers. About a quarter of the teachers who attend an ed camp are from urban schools. But we have set up an urban initiative where we are trying to connect with urban districts to bring our model in as part of their professional development, because we want to, we'd like to bring about systematic change across the, 15,000 districts, but especially the ones that are, have these lack of resources and teachers that are so stressed. We know that in the digital sphere, a lot of teachers have heard of Ed Camp, they're excited about it. But once you get outside that, once you get to the teachers who don't have the time to be on Twitter and following social media because they're just trying to keep their classes up and running, we're trying to figure out ways to connect with those teachers and allow them the experience, provide them with the experience of having a voice, of being treated like professionals, of sharing and collaborating together. So we're working on a couple of different strategies to make that happen.
Yeah,
that's great. I'm really excited to hear about that work. Go ahead, Kira.
I was going to say, I also worked with Philadelphia Education Fund. They did this really fabulous project where they reached out to existing teacher-led networks in Philadelphia, of which there were at least 20. I mean, there's a lot of teacher leadership happening in Philadelphia and all over the country. If you just look, you will see. But they really intentionally reached out to these groups and had to think very hard about the stance that they would take as kind of a broker between the teacher leaders in these groups and maybe some institutions or some other groups that these teacher leaders had less access to, and how would they kind of work as brokers, as folks who are helping to build relationships. They would set up opportunities for teacher leaders in these networks to meet with folks in the district or meet with folks who are offering grant opportunities and things like that. They would really think about how can their group, their institution, both let teachers take the lead in the work, but then also what is the resource that their education advocacy organization can offer to teacher leaders without kind of taking over and directing. And that took a lot of thinking and work around their own positionality, how to be transparent in what their kind of role and purpose was, and in thinking also about diversity, inclusion, and those kinds of things. And so that's something that for any educational advocacy organization, thinking about those things are critical. And it's also, I would say, as a teacher educator, really critical for schools of education to be thinking. If a school of education is just thinking about making partnerships with other schools just for student teaching, then they're really doing a disservice, I think. I think that what schools of education, and my vision is that schools of education should be doing work which is helping teachers, pre-service teachers, become involved in and learn about teacher-led networks that exist, and how to start that early on in their career, so that they can take control, take agency over their learning from the very get-go, and have that network of support very early on. And I think that needs to start from schools of education, and they need to be the brokers there. So those are my two pieces I can add, and I'll let you, Christina, I bet you can talk a bit about National Writing Project, or Philly Writing Project.
Hadley, I can. Do you want to say something? I saw you unmute.
No, you go ahead, and I'll follow up.
Okay. So yes, totally. That's awesome. And from a network perspective too, if I could, I mean, I work primarily with the national network these days, but I can see this in Philadelphia too, that there really are these like amazing ecosystems that start to form, and sometimes I try to figure out how can we also support the ecosystems in connecting, and not to take over each other's work either, but to best utilize all of our resources, right? So like in a resource tight environment, we want to be really careful to not be fighting against each other, but actually being able to work in sync with each other. And so it's really important to have groups like the Ed Fund and teacher education programs really supporting teachers in seeing these networks. I mean, I think that's like so important. I love that vision, and I think that's really important. And we have to think as networks about how to best leverage the power that we have, and to connect those powerful nodes. So what's exciting about this book to me is both the national perspective that you bring, Kira, but then also there's this power in that local focus, and how you're that starting to connect some of these pieces can help with some of the language across, like some of the language we use across our networks, and start to talk to each other potentially in better ways.
Yeah, I think that sometimes very, very particular stories are in some ways symbolic of things that are happening, patterns of things that are happening at a larger level. And I would also say that from the local level, looking at Philadelphia networks, that many teachers, when you talk about this ecosystem, many teachers are in multiple networks. So there's this really interesting web of connection among these different networks, because there are teachers who, once you get involved in one, you're like, oh, where's another one that I could get involved, because you get kind of drawn in. And I see like Hadley nodding her head, because you can jump in if you want. But there's a really vital ecosystem of teacher-led networks in local cities and across the country and internationally, that perhaps are a little bit under, not paid attention to quite as much as we should be paying attention to. And I think that I'm kind of trying to argue in this book is that teachers are doing a lot more than you realize they're doing, right? That a lot of the new pedagogies and curriculum and ideas and reshaping that is entering schools is happening because of these networks that are maybe happening outside of school spaces, and that teachers are bringing in and innovating. And then a lot of times, companies will come in and kind of slap their name on it and say that it's their idea, but it's coming from the teachers. I mean, I've gone to Ed Camps. I've seen the curriculum company people there trying to get their next great idea, because they know it comes from teachers.
Yeah, I have this image that I would love to figure out a way to map all of the people in all of those networks so that we could see all of the overlap, because I know that it's true that, EdCamp people are in so many networks, and it would be fascinating to be able to bring that to light so that people could see the depth of some of the networks that I don't think they even realize that, yes, they're doing this and they're doing that and they're doing this other thing, but there's actually a whole lot of support and richness that's already been created, but just hasn't been made visible yet. I just haven't figured out how to make that happen.
I think you've just identified my next study, Hadley. I'm just kidding.
I will fully support that, Kira.
And one of the things that I think in that process and that work, I think, is then seeing who's not there. And we've all been talking about that too, right? And so, you know, what are those sort of social justice and equity and inclusionary practices that we want to foster across our networks and help each other do even stronger, so that we can reach out further and sort of develop that reach, because we know that the power here is tremendous, and it's exponential too. So, you know, how do we really work on that? I think is an important conversation across networks, and something that that I look forward to sort of figuring out how to where are the points to have those conversations, like to create some actual notes where we can check in about that and really talk about it very consciously. I just want to say we're in the last few minutes, and so maybe I should offer that as like my last thought, and then open the floor for sort of final thoughts from both of you, so we can, you know, wrap the show for tonight. Although I'm super excited about the conversation we started.
I just want to thank you for having me. It's, you know, I believe 100% in teachers connecting with each other and supporting one another, and it's great to be part of this work. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here, Hadley. Really appreciate it.
And I want to also say thank you so much, Christina, to you for helping to organize this series. It's been really great to kind of talk out with so many people who are involved in the creation of this book. Many of the ideas and see how they're kind of living in real life, in real spaces, and have those great conversations. And you know, right now I'm kind of what I call my learning tour. I'm really listening to what people are kind of drawing from the text, and how it's speaking to them, and how they take from it. So I'm doing that at the book group. I'm doing that with this. You know, it's just been the most wonderful experience being on the listening tour, and hearing how people connect with the stories and what their own stories are.
Well, thank you, Kira. I really appreciate you working to put this book together, to being available for this webinar series, and then also for being on that listening tour. And I just want to say that at the conclusion of the book group, if you all would like to do another follow-up discussion here, we'd love to have you at Educator Innovator, because I do think that this is, you know, these are nodes in conversations, and if we keep that going, then we can that collective strength really becomes visible.
That's a fabulous idea. I will talk with the group and see what they say. But thank you for the offer.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so thank you all for, I'm looking for my notes of what I'm supposed to say at the end of the webinar, but thank you all who have you know, dialed in or downloaded this webinar, the CLTV today, to listen and to take part with us. The conversation continues at the hashtag Connected Learning, as well as the hashtag Teachers Transform. And we look forward to connecting with you online and in our extended networks. If you'd like to keep up to date on future opportunities here at Educator Innovator, visit educatorinnovator.org to sign up for our monthly newsletter, and you can also follow us at innovates_ed on Twitter. Okay, so thank you everyone, and thank you so much for being here and making and taking the time, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.